I am very excited to be with you today, just to go with you as we reimagine together a digitalized higher education in Africa. The starting point in reimagining the digitalization of higher education is to start with the history, going back to where we come from. Higher education in Africa was introduced by the colonial masters who came into the continent in the more than 300 years ago. And during that time, the elitist higher education actually started by the 19th century, when many of the colonizers were trying to settle and they were sending people in the colonies to do the work that they needed them to do. So most people who colonized Africa were the French and the British. And the red mark shows the French and the blue mark shows the British. There were some other colonies like Spain, Italy, very briefly, Portugal, and those were some of those countries that colonized Africa. And because this happened during the colonial era and in the 19th century, higher education in Europe was mostly elitist in nature. And therefore, we inherited the elitist higher education from the colonial masters. The systems and structures, curriculums and practices that we still use to this day were inherited from that culture. So, having to deal with that, post-independence, in the 1960s, many countries came up with policies because during that time, as they were trying to build new nations, there were no educational models that they can deal with. And they didn't have any educational models that they can rely on in terms of trying to build their own new countries. So instead, they came up with ways of developing these models themselves. And they came up with policies that were meant to widen participation in higher education. And at that time, there was high illiteracy rates. So the focus tended to be more on primary and secondary education. However, they still understood that higher education is critical to the development agenda of the country. And also it is critical for ensuring that they are going to be able to compete with the world as they see fit. However, these policies did not have very clear vision of the type of higher education that they were aspiring for. And as they were dealing with that, funding policies of the World Bank and other international donors came into play, and they emphasized to governments in Africa that they need to focus more on developing literacy rates. So the focus became more on the primary and higher education. So money was channeled into those two sectors of education. And in the process, they left behind higher education, forgetting that as people are going to be graduating from secondary schools, they will also want to get into higher education. So higher education was not properly resourced right at the beginning. And as higher education was dealing with all those things, globalization came into play with new liberalism and managerialism models that we find ourselves having to deal with in higher education. And we are dealing with these models in higher education that again emphasizes, that again focuses on those that have access, continue to have access, and those that did not have access were left behind. Those who had money to pay would have access into higher education. And those that did not have money, they found themselves continually marginalized by this new system that was introduced to us. So all these, the policies, the lack of models, the models that we inherited were all ill-suited and very unresponsive to the development agenda of the continent. And while we are dealing with some of those issues, then challenges, very recent challenges came in. Technological disruption came with a big bang. And while we are dealing with the technological disruption, and that we could handle because we could just go on with the way we've been doing business. And even though there was no electricity, there was no ICT infrastructure or connectivity, we continued to do business the way we were doing it. And then at the same time, I spoke about the inadequate funding and resources that was channeled mainly to primary and secondary education, and higher education struggled for a while because of lack of funding. And then you find that many higher education institutions in the continent are becoming more and more privatized. Again, I am emphasizing that issue of those who have access continue, or those who have ability to pay for access continue to have access to education. So the whole issue of the public good of education has been taken away from the public space that needed to support education. And the sluggish economic growth really did not help either. The lack of skills and expertise of people to teach in higher education, to do research in higher education, is continually becoming more and more of a problem as many high-skilled people leave the continent. There's a huge brain drain in the continent because people are leaving the continent for other places, for greener pastures elsewhere. And as we were dealing with all those massive challenges that I'm referring to, COVID-19 pandemic came in, and it came with a big, big bang. All of a sudden, things had to change. Everybody had to move to an online space in order to ensure that teaching and learning occurs. And as teaching and learning occurs in this space, does not have enough resources to enable us to access technologies as much as we should. And technology as such during COVID-19 has made it a necessary tool, a necessary important tool, because it was the only tool that we can use to socialize, to go to the doctors, to do anything that we wanted to do, because every person had to work in their own spaces. There is no doubt that change is at our doorstep. And change is here, and change needs to be embraced. And there is no doubt that embracing change is not an easy concept. It actually demands of us to have a mind change, a different type of mindset that says if something is very important for us, we will find a way to do it. And if not, we'll find more and more excuses of lack of connectivity, lack of ICT infrastructure, lack of digital skills, lack of all the things that I have mentioned before. However, it is absolutely, absolutely critical to ensure that we change. And if we don't, we will be left behind and will continually find ourselves in positions that we are in now. I'm talking about change because we educate for the future. Life itself is about the future. Education itself is about the future. The future is an important component of what we are engaged in on a regular basis. As a country, we are engaged in the development agenda of the country. The African Union Agenda 2063 is very clear about what needs to be done in terms of the development agenda. The national development plans of every country, virtually every country in the continent has a national development plan that asks us to look at the development issues in order for us to compete globally with other nations. Economic growth is one key element that we go to education for. We go to education so that we are able to contribute effectively into the economies of our country. One area that is majorly neglected is the social cohesion. Africa has a very difficult history. From colonial, there have been so many wars, and there's been so many battles towards the freedom that many countries attained from different oppressors of previous years that made it important for us And it is still very important for us to have an education system that focuses on social cohesion. Part of the problem that we have not been able to move forward despite the policies, despite all the things that I've mentioned before, is that many leaders are unwilling to see the forest for the trees. Part of the problem is because many leaders tend to be operational versus strategic. The role of a leader is to provide a strategic direction to the institution, is to come up with plans, is to dream about the higher education they want. And without that, we will be unable to move forward as a country. Strategic planning is not planning for tomorrow or day after tomorrow, but it is planning for a long, long haul. And today's challenges are not tomorrow's challenges. Hence, we cannot zoom in and focus on what we don't have, rather and instead of focusing on what we aspire to have, so that we can take those baby steps towards that aspiration. Many of our higher education institutions tend to be vertical and very highly hierarchical. And the focus there is more on improving workflow efficiencies. And the leaders here, they are running institutions that are heavily specialized, and forgetting that in an academic environment, you need people who are going to be creative. You need people who are going to be innovative. And because experimentation and innovation is minimized, we find ourselves having to work in an environment that is heavily rule-based work relations, where we have to rely and we are guided by documents and books and reports and writing reports of different forms. And traditional leaders will never thrive in a digital leadership. They will never thrive in a digital environment because the digital environment requires us to do things differently. It requires us to have a shared influence. It requires our leaders who are able to set goals and interventions and create teams and work with different people. So the structure in digital leadership is flatter than the structure in traditional leadership. And also because we work with teams, we are enabled to develop those networks, not only within our institutions, but beyond our institutions internationally. And those teams we are going to add into the new knowledge systems or the diversity of knowledges that we aspire for. So the work of the digital leader, therefore, to enable this to happen is to create the environment where innovation is bound to strive. Open systems that we use, which are living systems, systems that are enabling movement, and systems that are flexible enough to accommodate new changes, systems that are complex and adaptive, are the ones that are going to make it in the new digital space. So digital leaders need to be very, very different from the traditional leaders that we are used to. The futures research studies have shown that the future of universities will be likely to be more open. It will be digital, as we have seen with COVID-19, that forced all of us to use technologies for different forms of doing things. It will be collaborative. We were forced to work together. We were forced to come up with different skills and knowledge in order for us to work together. It will be much more personalized, where people can be able to come up with different programs that they want. They can go and get a MOOC, an OER, and then put together. And as they are doing that, they are receiving badges from different providers. So education will no longer be something of a classroom. So people will have the freedom. And sometimes you will learn from a community of people who are developing knowledges or who are coming up with different types of knowledges. So there'll be a diversity of cultural and epistemic knowledges that are going to be part of the higher education sector. Instead of the knowledges that we have inherited over the years, that we don't even know where they're coming from, but that we are continuing, and the knowledges that are not working for us in the current system. It is therefore important to understand that leading change requires leaders to rethink about the vision of the university. Where does the university want to go to? What type of a vision we aspire for? What type of a higher education we want in 2030, in 2040, in 2050, even beyond. We also need to rethink the mission of the university. For many years, we have been using the mission that other people have come up with, but we have not come up with a mission that is African-centric, that focuses on the needs of the continent, the mission that will address the development agenda, the economic growth of the country, that will address the type of minerals and the type of the environment that we find ourselves in. We also need to redefine higher education in relation to the social justice mandate. This is important because social justice mandate will enable us to look at those social unjust practices that have been going on in higher education that will enable us to move and strengthen some of the just practices that we need to move into with and to move forward with. And therefore, we need to come up with workable solutions. We need to repurpose our education in order to come up with solutions, homegrown solutions from our sector. So the starting point really when we try to do that is to vision. So leadership must come up with ideas of how we vision the future. We have to create conditions for change. We have to start by identifying trends and look out for opportunities. COVID has been one of the opportunities that we found ourselves in, because all of a sudden we were thrown into a space where we had to think on our feet and come up with new ideas and come up with new ways, pedagogical ways of doing things. And therefore, it's important for us to start developing systems and structures that will help leaders to thrive, that will help higher education to thrive. Above all this will only be possible if we bring people along. And with the hierarchical structures that the type of leaders are comfortable with, this won't work. People need to feel that they are part of the solution that we want for the future. So it's important for leaders to motivate people and give them a sense of belonging into the university that we are aspiring for. So to do that, leaders are expected to be flexible and adaptive to changing environment. You cannot change unless you are flexible. Leaders are expected to take risks by trying out new things and opening up innovation spaces within universities where people can come up with new things that are challenging our conventional way of doing things. And that way we will be able to come up with ways that are different from what we are doing. We need to create and convey a compelling vision, a vision that will pull us forward, that will inspire us to become or to do things differently in the higher education sector that we aspire for. We need to bring people together and give them a sense of hope. So the vision must be able to give people a sense of hope. I cannot begin to tell you how discouraged people are, how unmotivated academic staff are in our sector, because it's the same thing over and over again and you don't see the results. Above all, leaders have to ensure that resources are made available to support all these processes in order for us to see change happening in the speed that we want. Leading change requires resilient leaders who have the ability to recover, to learn from, and grow stronger in the face of adversity. We have been in the middle of the COVID, and at least from this whole perspective, we need to come out and grow stronger from these adversities that we face. And this is according to Reid 2018, who is a strong proponent of resilient leadership. Part of the reason that we have to do this work is because we want to address the social justice mandate of education, which is economic justice that enable people to have access, economic access to education, the cultural justice where we can see ourselves in the curriculum. As I had mentioned earlier, that we have inherited the curriculum that we are using in Africa to this day. And this curriculum, many of us cannot see ourselves within the curriculum. The curriculum is not addressing the issues that are at hand. And therefore, leaders should begin to think about how curriculum should be inclusive enough to enable us to develop the countries that we want, to address the development agenda of the countries. We also need to think about equitability. And equitability is completely different from equality. Coming from the country in South Africa, when we got our independence in 1994, we talked about equality. But I can tell you right now that the difference between equality and equitability are two different things. Those that had access to many things, to resources, to opportunities, now are even having more access to all those things, whereas those that did not have are still remaining marginalized the same way as they did. So equitability, it's a way of working out a system where you are bringing everybody, and you start with those at the lowest level and you bring them up so that when they start competing, they compete in a playing field that will enable them as well to compete, to be in a field that they are enabled to function in the same level and in the same space. So higher education needs to invest in supporting marginalized communities, in supporting people who have been denied access into these spaces that we find ourselves. Digital justice is one that is absolutely important in the era of digitalization, because without the access to ICT, connectivity, and also even resources to like devices, you will not be able to participate. And therefore, you will be left behind in the space of participation. So all these principles are something that we need to think about as we move forward as leaders in higher education. Now, there are principles that we have in the continent that are needed to be used. And those principles are the principles of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is based on one's relations to others. That is, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. I am because of others. And if we move away, just a little away, from the elitist type of an individualized form of teaching and learning and move into education and look at education as a common good that reflects our social and cultural practices and that engenders participation, we will be able to build the higher education we want. The higher education based on the Ubuntu philosophy that implies that a leader should create an environment where people can work collaboratively to achieve learning and teaching outcome. And this is very important. Ubuntu is about cooperation, reciprocity, and empathy. It's not about individualism, competitiveness, and therefore it is important for us to go back and look at some of the principles that build these beautiful countries of ours in the past and ensure that we ingrain them into the higher education space. I'm not saying we shouldn't include other values, but we also need to embrace the values that have been excluded, systematically excluded from being part of the knowledge system that we can contribute to the world and, more importantly, to the nations that we aspire for. And our moral responsibility, finally, is not to stop the future from happening. So as higher education leaders, it is important to shape the future, to channel its destiny in humane directions, and to ease the trauma of transition, because we are in a changing environment, and change is hard. Change is difficult. Change is not easy, but change needs to happen. And this quotation is from Alvin Toffler, who talked about the future on his book on Futures Talk. Thank you very much, colleagues, for listening to me and for being with me during this time. And as I said earlier, I invited my ancestors to take this journey with me as I share leadership in Africa with you. Thank you and best of luck in your studies.